Hello, and welcome to another episode of Trauma Liberation with Alba, Cordero, Soto. So let's dive right in. As we continue on this series to break down the concept of trauma is the gateway drug, and addiction saves more lives than it takes. This episode, we're going to talk about alcoholism. And I was very intentional today to dress in a way that as Hispanics we would say en luto, or in a state of grief, because as I think at the effects of alcoholism on our communities, on our nation, and right in our homes, I just feel a sense of sadness, while also standing very strong on the statement that I said, which is trauma is the gateway drug, and addiction saves more lives than it takes. So I want to recap a moment on one of the last episodes that we talked about. What is addiction? Addiction is a chronic and relapsing condition in which there's compulsive drug seeking and use despite the adverse consequences. So if we can think about for a quick second just the prevalence of alcoholism in our nation. I was looking at some statistics from 2001, and it says that 29.5 million people ages 12 and up suffer from alcohol use disorder. Out of that, I'm going to break it down into different demographics just to give you a little bit more of an understanding of how it breaks down. So 18.7 million whites are reported to have alcohol use disorder. 3.5 million blacks are said to suffer from alcohol use disorder. 280,000 Indians or Native Americans suffer from alcohol use disorder. 144,000 Pacific Islanders or Hawaiian natives. Nearly 1 million at 982,000 Asians suffer from alcohol use disorder. And 5.1 million Hispanics or Latinos suffer from alcohol use disorder. So if this is so prevalent, then you might want to ask me, how is it that you say that addiction saves lives, when we know for a fact that the complications of alcohol do cause a significant amount of mortality and morbidity? And at what cost, right? So I'm sure some of you guys are sitting here and thinking about a loved one that is in the hospital right now as a result of maybe liver cirrhosis or liver cancer as a result of alcoholism. Others of you might be struggling with the reality that alcoholism is the cause of your divorce. Some of you may be remembering that empty seat at that graduation that your parent never made it to as a result of alcoholism. And others of you might even have a very almost repulsive memory of a moment in which your loved one came, or even you came to the table under the influence, and it ended in quite the scene. Almost like something that was talked about for years, going back to that moment in which that person just happened to get reactive in a way that maybe wasn't warranted for the circumstance or the situation. But because alcohol was involved, it went south. So then how do you get to the concept or the reality that trauma is the gateway drug? So I want to sit here and just talk a little bit about what is trauma, right? So a traumatic event is something that occurs to just about anybody having the human experience called life. So dealing with loss of a loved one or having to see your loved one take their last breath, finding your loved one suddenly dead when you come home to check on them. Being in a car accident in which you were the only survivor and now you're struggling with survivor's guilt because you were the one that was driving. A traumatic event could be abandonment as a child, sexual trauma. It could be many things in which there is this effect on your mind and body in which there is a level of disconnection or disassociation that happens in which it's too much to process at that time. And because it is too much to process at that time, the brain decides to suppress or disconnect or disassociate as a protective mechanism for dealing with this very heavy, emotionally charged, and almost difficult to process at that time, because depending on the age that you are when you experience this traumatic event, you might not have the emotional intelligence or the capacity to truly conceptualize, what do I do when I am 6 years old and I have an adult that's touching me inappropriately and I don't have words to explain what is happening to me, right? What happens when you come home every day to somebody who's physically assaulting you and beating you just because it's Sunday? These are moments in which it's too much for one to handle at times. And the challenge is that alcohol is very easily accessible. And as hard as it is to also admit, is that culturally, many cultures condone and support the use of alcohol in order to socialize, in order to give you enough courage to say and do things, in order for you to, in essence, be yourself or continue to coast through life. So coming back to the effects of trauma, I want to talk about the emotional impact that trauma has. I have a list here. Usually within a couple of days of experiencing trauma, if not weeks or so later, a person would experience a heightened sense of danger, anger, nightmares, isolation or withdrawal, fear or anxiety, emotional swings, difficulty sleeping, flashbacks, hypervigilance, which means that you're super, ultra, mega aware of your surroundings, so much so that you're constantly ready to fight or flight. Depression, guilt, sorrow, remorse, or even shame. Difficulty concentrating, irritability, feeling numb, or having a sense of loss of control. Now, with all of these things that I just expressed, alcohol is a cure for just about all of those symptoms. Alcohol is classified as a depressant. It helps to relax your central nervous system, and some of the effects of alcohol, they vary depending on how much alcohol consumption there is. And it's very interesting because as I was preparing for today, I couldn't help but acknowledge the reality that when a person is experiencing this deep sense of suffering, this pain, this agony as a result of sudden grief, as a result of sexual trauma, as a result of, you name it, you can fill in the blank. It makes sense why a person would want to alleviate that pain and suffering. Just the same way it makes sense for a person with a headache to reach for a Tylenol. And even though the effects and the prevalence and oftentimes the sadness that is at the end of a bottle is still true. It's still very true that alcohol has affected all of us in many different ways, negatively, but also positively. You can't tell me that there aren't also certain circumstances in which there is a happy memory, where there's a wedding celebration, there is a graduation ceremony, right? And oftentimes in these happy moments, alcohol is very much in the picture. There are circumstances in which people have a gift or a talent to sing or to speak in front of the masses, but their anxiety affects their ability to just go up there and speak or sing. So then alcohol tends to be that drug that can help just ease the nerves just enough to be able to allow the person to just go up there and express their gifts. There are also many circumstances in which a person is just trying to function. Because the reality is that as much as alcohol is very much everywhere in our community, right? I'm just thinking of, as I drive through the Brockton community, I see a liquor store, sometimes on every other corner. And as I drive first thing in the morning, oftentimes I can see the the line of people waiting for it to open up. And I can't help but think of how much money is spent. For those that are heavy drinkers, $250 billion a year is made off alcohol, off of those heavy drinkers. That's money that oftentimes could have been for your mortgage, for your lights, for your kids' school sneakers. But because alcohol is such a dependent drug that if you don't continue to consume the alcohol, it can lead to seizures, it can lead to delirium, and it could even lead to death. How is it that this drug is so legal when in all actuality it can be so dangerous? And it impacts so many people in different ways. And even then, the solution sometimes, I think, it's like, there was a time when there was no liquor store open on Sundays, and I don't think it actually solved anything. Because people would buy the alcohol the day before, and they would sell it for double the price on Sundays. So the idea of doing away doesn't actually solve the problem. I think that the challenge that we have here is trying to understand how culture plays a role in the alcohol consumption, how trauma oftentimes at its root and the desire to no longer feel that pain and suffering is oftentimes the root or the challenge that many people aren't actually addressing or dealing with. So as I try to continue to segue this and share with you some tools and some just glimmers of hope for ourselves that are struggling, for our family members that are being impacted, for our communities that are also being impacted, I want to just take a moment and acknowledge that there is nothing wrong with the desire to not feel the pain any longer. And once you understand that as we walk through this world, there's this desire to not feel pain naturally that we all as human beings experience, those that are using alcohol as a form of pain relief, it's no different. So I would like to just kind of let you chew on that for a second and think about the fact that there's this shared reality that we all suffer and we all desire to get some alleviation from that suffering. Now, as I think about how do we now, in understanding that trauma oftentimes is at the root, there's a lot of culture and learned behavior and examples that we have that affect our ability to make decisions regarding which coping skill do I use in order to experience less pain? So I am Dominican, and in the Dominican culture, alcohol is always, always in the mix. And from what I understand to be true, it is actually rare, or almost like there's something wrong with you if there's a social event and there's no alcohol. And if there is an event where there's no alcohol, you better believe that somebody is coming with a box of beer in hand, for reasons that socializing and alcohol in the Hispanic culture go hand in hand. Now, I have many clients and patients that I work with that are of different cultures. For example, the Cape Verdean culture. And one of my clients had said to me, he said, you know, it's hard to not drink, because when I make the decision not to drink, the people that are drinking will come to me and say, if you're not drinking, then you have to pay for all of our drinks. So as a consequence to not drinking, you now have the task of paying for our drinks. I said, So now, not only is there's an amount of pressure to drink, but now you're going to be punished. Maybe not literally, right? But socially, there's a level of pressure being put on to say, if you don't drink, then we're going to rally together and say that now you have to pay for the fact that you're choosing not to drink. And we are. And I found that to be very sad, because as much as that may be a lighthearted joke, I'm sure for the individual that is struggling with, if this is truly an issue for them, or struggling with every day making the decision not to drink for reasons that they lost everything. They lost their spouse, they lost their home, their relationship with their children is estranged, they lost their license, they lost their career, and they are struggling to make the decision to not drink. And now, just because there's a social event, they're being pressured to drink because it's so socially and culturally acceptable for many of our cultures. Haitian culture, similarly as well, as many of my clients have expressed. And as I think about a lot of the generational trauma that gets passed down within many Caribbean households, whether we're talking about the fact that there's this creepy uncle at the table that, even though we know that this person cannot be trusted alone with children, we're going to invite him to the dinner table anyways. Because we know that in this family, there's a significant amount of adultery that goes on, so much so that we know that there are other families or other children that we don't speak of, but we know that they exist. Even though there are families that are experiencing domestic violence, and many other generational traumas that just get passed down from one generation to another, but we don't speak about it. We don't. It's like, lo que pasa en la casa se queda en la casa. What happens in the house stays in this house. And as a result of that concept, that ideology, that motto in which many of us stand behind, there's this need to numb out. There's this need to not address head on these circumstances that are extremely uncomfortable, very unsafe, and very hurtful. So instead, we invite alcohol to the event. And it makes it so that we don't have to talk about it. We don't have to truly deal with it. And in those moments, it's very interesting because alcohol can tend to decrease our sense of judgment. And in having our judgment impaired, having our reaction time delayed, oftentimes it can lead to conflict. So the question here is alcohol truly alleviating the suffering? Or is it just prolonging the suffering and creating other chaos that is now the focus? Because now we're focusing on the fact that, oh, as a result of Uncle Jim having a little too much to drink, he got into a fight with his spouse and the whole thing went crazy. So now we're just going to focus on that. We're not going to focus on what's happening underneath the rug because we swept all that under the rug. We're not dealing with that, right? So one of the things that I want to continue to express and kind of nail down is that the use of alcohol or other substances, we talked about marijuana, we're going to talk about other substances in other episodes, is that even though there's a desire to alleviate pain and suffering, there's also a numbing and an impaired judgment. There's a disassociation that happens, or detachment, which ultimately ends up delaying our ability to respond, delaying our ability to actually heal and deal and process so that we can become that transformed and better version of ourselves. So, what can we do in order to address and deal with the elephant in the room? So if we're talking about trauma, and we're talking about the fact that there are so many family secrets, there are so many unresolved issues that are at the root of all of these things, how can we, as a community, as a people, how can we actually address the elephant in the room instead of drowning the elephant with alcohol as to avoid a problem that ends up becoming a bigger problem? So part of that has to do with being able to be in your body. In order for you to truly be in your body, which includes your voice being an integral part of your body, You have to be willing to try to live life in a sober way and see how that feels. Because just the same way alcohol drowns out the sad moments, it actually drowns out the happy moments too. Just the same way it takes away the grief and sadness, it also drowns out the love and joy that you have when you get to see your grandchild graduate or get married. Because everything just gets very bland in essence. And it's not to say that everybody experiences alcoholism or alcohol in the same way. It's just that in different stages and at different amounts, it reacts differently. And until you have too much, sometimes it can be difficult to gauge how much is too much. And as your tolerance grows, too much changes to the point where now it's not how much is too much, is how early can I get to the liquor store before I start experiencing hand tremors. And even though there are many things that I can share statistically about the negative consequence of alcoholism, I don't think that the answer is to share those statistics or to instill fear when we are already in a very fearful state as a nation. But instead, it's important to give ourselves grace. Grace for not knowing any better. Because oftentimes as adults, we will model certain coping skills that our children will then adapt. Oftentimes in our environment, we will keep a mini bar for social events. And when a child is experiencing being bullied, feeling depressed as a result of social media being something that now is, causing them to have low self-esteem or question who they are, that drug that is so easy to access typically is not fentanyl. Typically, it's not even marijuana. It typically is in our basement in the minibar. And that can lead to a lifetime of not being able to fully feel and express the reason why they even picked up the bottle in the first place. So I had mentioned the importance of being in your body and being able to have discernment, have your ability to judge what is safe, what isn't safe. And it is very important to be able to use our voice to express the pain that we feel, to express the discomfort that it feels to come to a social event or come to a family event in which it's awkward because why is this person still invited? And why is it that I have to now protect or hide or be hypervigilant around my children because so-and-so is also here? So being able to be in my body, be in my voice can help me to empower others to also use their voice, to also break the silence, to also be present, to having uncomfortable conversations. Because sometimes we just got to have these uncomfortable conversations. We can't numb and avoid our whole lives, because that's how we got to the state that we're in now. So there are many, many treatment modalities for alcohol use disorder, and we've gotten so far in being able to understand how these medications and or therapy can make a significant amount of progress in being able to give people their life back, give them back that sense of control, give them back that reality that, wow, now I'm living. Now I'm no longer ashamed to go out and be around family, because I no longer feel like they're judging me as a result of me always coming here intoxicated. So those modalities are out there and available for anybody who wants the help. Now, it's important to understand that the person has to be in a state of acceptance that it's a problem to begin with, which is, half of the battle. Because I can't feel so strongly about your problem, so much so that I'm going to change you. That's not how it works. So you have to be willing and able to give yourself that grace to forgive yourself for the many decisions that led up to alcohol becoming such an issue that now you're dealing with the negative consequences of that. And now you're having to pick up the pieces. And now you're left with, I have to come to terms with this. And it takes a lot of courage to say, I need help. And I can't do this alone. And with the different treatments that are available, I had mentioned counseling, because being able to understand the pain and suffering that is underneath the numbing out is a huge part of it. And as a helper, there's oftentimes medications that a person can take, not only to help them avoid withdrawal seizures, avoid the effects of the alcohol dependency, but also it can help with cravings. It can make it so that it blocks the euphoric effect of alcohol. And you could even do a once-a-month injection that could help you with the alcohol. But definitely, the first step is acknowledging that there's nothing wrong with wanting to alleviate the pain and suffering. And maybe alcohol is actually prolonging my suffering or causing more suffering than I signed up for in the beginning. And it's time for me to break the cycle, to break the chain, and live life positively and in hopes to have reciprocal relationships in which I can be present. Thank you for joining me on this journey. And I hope to see you next time for the next episode of Trauma Liberation. Thank you.